We hope you enjoyed your lunch. And with that short video, we were able to open the second part of today's event, so the afternoon session. For this, we would like to turn to our moderator, Mr. Tim Curtis, who is the chief of the Living Heritage Entity, Secretary of the Convention for the Safeguarding of ICH. We'd also like to hear from Honorable Mr. Ralph Regenavanu, Minister of Climate Change, Environment and Energy, Government of Vanuatu, Mr. Han Kyung-gu, Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, Ms. Karima Benu, former UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights and author of reports on culture, climate change, and cultural rights, Ms. Gulnara Aitspaeva, Director of the Ajin Cultural Research Center, Ms. Hindu Umaru, of co-chair International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate
Good
Change.
afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen.
We will watch the video first.
Sorry. The video should come later, I think. No, the video was supposed to come later. Sorry, I think the video comes a bit later. Give me... No. Perhaps if I could ask the registrar, I'll introduce the panel and the thematic and then show the video, if they can have a few minutes.
지금 오디오가 잠시 되지 않아서.
Yes, I feel that there are some technical issues, so perhaps we'd like to hear the introduction of the panelists first, and then we can turn to the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, colleagues, and dear participants, good afternoon and welcome back to this second session of this important celebration on living heritage and the natural world. I hope you had a good lunch after this morning's very rich contributions. My name is Tim Curtis, and I'm the secretary of the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. And I'm very pleased to be here today with a really exceptional panel, speaking on what I believe to be a very important theme, an important aspect of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. Now, I think as has been explained, there's only 3 of us here, but I understand there's 3 important panelists who will participate online, and who I hope we should be seeing them on the screen. Today's theme is really of importance, of course, not only for the future of our convention. Here we have our panelists online, and I'll introduce them in a minute, but today's theme is of importance, of course, for our lives and for the entire planet. More and more, our very ways of life are becoming threatened by changes to the environment around us. We see every month, every day on the news, rising sea levels, flooding, drought, worsening wildfires. And these are displacing whole communities and destroying the places and resources needed for them to practice and transmit their intangible cultural heritage, their living heritage. At the same time, this living heritage carries with it environmental knowledge and practices that have been transmitted over generations and has some time-tested solutions for adaptations to challenges within those contexts. And in that sense, they may also give us time-tested solutions to mitigating some of these adverse effects we are suffering at the moment from our dysfunctional relationship with the natural world. And in that sense, ICH also has an important role in shaping and reaffirming the relationship we have with nature. And we can see many examples in the lists and in various forms of living heritage that help to foster and transmit values of respect, custodianship, and connectedness with nature. So understanding and valorizing these different values through safeguarding living heritage should be able to help us to think about new ways of building a sustainable relationship with our planet, new ways of conserving in a more holistic manner the world's biodiversity for future generations. And so the purpose of this panel is therefore to explore some of the challenges and contributions of living heritage to address issues around biodiversity loss, climate change, and our general environmental sustainability. And we're lucky to hear from perspectives and experiences from an impressive panel with experiences around the globe about how we might build on living heritage to restore our relationship with the natural world and develop more responsible and sustainable behaviors for our future. So today's roundtable will include a question to each of our 5 panelists who are joining us today. I will be introducing them as we go along, but before I begin, I think we have a short video from a youth participant from St. Kitts and Nevis who can help us to start our discussions. Could we have the video, please?
My name is Otis Jeffers of St. Kitts and Nevis. St. Kitts is one of the Leeward Islands in the Lesser Antilles. Many years ago, the indigenous Arawak tribe that inhabited the island made reference to St. Kitts as Layamega, which means fertile land. Agriculture was the main activity as a means of survival. Our fertile soil, along with its fresh water, abundant forests, was an attraction which influenced other settlers to heavily invest in our lands by growing of sugarcane. Today, while agriculture is still considered an activity which benefits thousands of citizens, including myself, I can predict that next 70 years, our fertile land will be considered to be degraded, making it less productive for agriculture. Modern agriculture, such as intensive tillage and heavy use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, will lead to loss of soil fertility, water depletion, and climate change. To our local government, policy, and decision makers, help us in promoting even more living heritage as a way of educating the future generations using knowledge and techniques that has been transmitted in the community for generations, such as beekeeping, composting, zero tillage, agroforestry. The future depends on what we do today.
So that was, I think, a powerful message from Otis Jeffers from St. Kitts and Nevis, who really, I think, covered a number of issues that we'll be talking about today. And so I think with that, I'd like to go on and start with our 5 very esteemed panelists and to hear their perspectives on the topic. And it's a great honor for me to welcome as the first speaker His Excellency Honorable Mr. Ralph Regenvanu, who's joining us today from Vanuatu. Your Excellency, you are Vanuatu's Minister for Climate Change Adaptation, Meteorology and Geohazards, Energy, Environment and Disaster Management. You have been also Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Lands. You have extensive experience working also before that with culture and including living heritage. You were a member of the International Drafting Committee of the 2003 Convention and on the first international jury of the UNESCO Proclamation of Masterpieces of Oral and Intangible Heritage of Humanity. And you were also instrumental in developing Vanuatu's National Sustainable Development Plan from 2016 to 2030. So thank you very much, Minister, for taking the time to be with us today. And I'd like to ask you why you think it's important to integrate intangible cultural heritage into national sustainable development plans, particularly for climate change adaptation, biodiversity, and disaster risk reduction. What do you see as the challenges that exist, and how do you think these can be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And it's a real pleasure to be back here in the context of the Convention on the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. Because as you said, Tim, I was involved for 5 years in drafting this convention, right from 1999 until it was passed by UNESCO in 2003. So I feel very close to the convention and how it was developed. And it's so great that we are now celebrating 20 years and all the fantastic work that has been done in valorizing this most critical element of our identities as humans living in this world. What is so important about the intangible cultural heritage is that essentially it is how we as humans have developed protocols or modalities or ways to live within the environments we are living in. So each culture in the world evolves in relation to its environment. And that's why our cultures are so different. And that's why we have different ways of conceptualizing the way we live, what we know about ourselves, our epistemologies, how we relate to each other, all the facets of what it means to be a social, living, cultural human being. So this interaction with the environment, between humans and the environment, is the essence of intangible cultural heritage. And therefore, the knowledge that is built up as a result of these interactions is essential for knowing how to properly live in these environments. And this was something that I think it was a very critical moment for the global community in Montreal in December last year, when in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the world passed the Montreal Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, which recognized explicitly for the first time that the ways people live in their environments are in fact the most effective ways of conserving biodiversity, conserving the natural environment in a way that is sustainable, much more so than, for example, states creating national parks. So this was a really, for me, a great step forward in the global understanding of what it means to properly manage our natural environment. And the sort of outcome from that I saw was that the world recognized that it is the living ways people live in their environment that are the most effective ways of preserving environments, particularly indigenous peoples and local communities who have been living in these environments for generations and know how they can survive and sustain themselves. And they know also that their survival depends on the sustenance of these environments. So in this context that we find ourselves now of climate change, we are seeing changes in the climate that are unprecedented in terms of their rapidity, in how fast it's happening compared to, for example, in the Pacific, my people, we have been living in the islands of Vanuatu for thousands of years. And we know our environments. We have some of the internationally recognized biological hotspots, biodiversity hotspots in our islands because the environments are so well preserved. And this is as a result of generations of intangible cultural heritage, traditional ecological knowledge, traditional resource management practices passed down from generation to generation as the intangible cultural heritage is. And this is what has enabled us to survive in these environments and prosper. In the context of climate change, it becomes increasingly important that we take aspects of that intangible cultural heritage that have helped us to survive and use them to adapt to the changing environment we find ourselves in. Climate change is happening, as I said, at an unprecedented rate. We've never experienced this level of change in our climatic conditions, the slow onset events such as sea level rise and the change in agricultural patterns where we can grow certain crops and where we can't, the change in the movement of species, particularly fish species in our oceans, also the ways in which we can predict the weather, the changes in the weather and the changes in the seasons and how we revolve our agricultural practices around this. We are also adapting our indigenous knowledge, our intangible cultural heritage to this changing environment. And what we have found in Vanuatu, we developed a National Sustainable Development Plan, which I was part of, which aligns with the 15-year Sustainable Development Goals period that the United Nations has allotted from 2015 to 2030. We have 3 pillars: the economy pillar, the society pillar, the environment pillar, on a foundation which is our culture. And we recognize that the culture informs all of these pillars and all these ways we are going to be developing our country. And we are trying to use this knowledge as a way to make ourselves resilient. We've always been resilient in these environments because we've survived in them for so many years. But in that knowledge is the key also to our resilience. And so we are, of course, utilizing the latest Western science, but using it in a co-management model with our Indigenous knowledge, with our intangible cultural heritage, our ways of being, of living, of interacting, of expressing ourselves, of living in our environments, of sustaining ourselves. These are all aspects which have become critical to our National Sustainable Development Plan, our disaster risk resilience strategy, our climate change national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. There's a whole section on using our traditional knowledge and Indigenous cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage as the basis for the actions we will take moving forward. And for us, it's become increasingly critical to have early childhood learning about their environment in that context of their own environment, learning from their elders about what the species are, what their movements are, what their behaviors are like, how do we use certain species in the environment for certain purposes. This is all essential knowledge for the survival of these young people we are bringing up into this world today. And so without that very learned and experienced interaction with the environment that is the basis of our cultural heritage, we would be kind of lost and rudderless moving into this future of uncertainty, climate change, and so on. But this provides a very important rudder, steering us, helping us to move in the right direction, because you know it's based on centuries of learned experience, which is the intangible cultural heritage of our people. Thank you, Tim. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for sharing some really powerful ideas and experiences from Vanuatu, which I think, clearly on the front line also of the changes we're all facing, and it's very interesting to hear how you approach this, particularly in your role as a minister now for climate change and having been on the drafting panel for the convention itself. And we'd like to now go to another part of the world and to our second speaker, Ms. Hindu Umaru, who's joining us also online. Hindu, you are a co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and a United Nations Sustainable Development Advocate. You're a respected leader from Chad's Mbororo pastoralist community and a recognized supporter of Indigenous peoples' adaptation and mitigation efforts against climate change. You're also the president of the Association for Indigenous Peoples, for the Association of Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, from which you passionately advocate for increased participation and integration of Indigenous peoples' wisdom and traditions in the global fight against climate change. So, Ms. Umaru, I'd like to ask you why you believe it is critical to bring these voices of Indigenous people to the forefront of these discussions. What can the world learn from Indigenous peoples regarding our relationship with nature and to help us all tackle the crisis of climate change?
Thank you so much, team, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from my time. It's very early, so I apologize first for my energy. So thank you for welcoming me in this important discussion also, and I'm so sorry to do not join you in person. Team, today we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of this important convention on intangible cultural heritage. And these conventions is needed now than ever And as you name it, and also the excellency from Vanuatu name it, because of the climate change and biodiversity loss, we need these conventions now than ever. As indigenous peoples, we have always known that the value of our culture, our tradition, our knowledge is very important for fighting climate change and conserving the biodiversity. We as indigenous peoples, we are the bridge between our cultural heritage in the modern world. We live in harmony in this nature. We know how to conserve it, how to protect it. And this traditional knowledge is very essential for us as indigenous peoples, but also essential for all the rest of the world that wanted to put the effort to combat climate change and to preserve the biodiversity. His Excellency said, our land are the most high spot biodiversity around the world. That's why we are protecting the 80% of the world's biodiversity. Because our traditional knowledge, you can find all the solutions for adaptations, for resilience, for forestry, for ecosystem regenerations, just with our way of living. As pastoralists in my communities, we are the ones who are maintaining the soil to be more fertile, even with this climate change impact. We can find the most critical food even in the most drought season, or you can find the indigenous grandmother or grandfather who can find a food and fresh water even after a hurricane hitting their island in Pacific. So our way of living is best in protection of the nature. It is so important to have it in these discussions today, because our way of living is based on the 7 generations that are past. We learn from them. And when we take a decision, it's based on the 7 upcoming generations. So our way of living is based on the very long-term visions. And you will not find our traditional knowledge where you are now. You are found only in the memory of our grandfather and the memory of our grandmothers. So our knowledge about nature is so big than Wikipedia, but it is not written in the books. It is transmitted orally from mother to daughter, from father to son. So that's why protecting this immaterial heritage is so important for the world. Because we all know the modern knowledge, if your computer dies or if you are not with electricity, you can have your knowledge in the internet. We know how to find it in the library because you've written it in the book. But most of our indigenous people's traditional knowledge are immaterial. It is a communities who have the knowledge. And when like the communities in Amazon or in Asia or in Africa disappear, it is the equivalent of millions of books and 1,000 of knowledge. So that's why it is so important across the world to protect the indigenous people's traditional knowledge and then to value them through these conventions. But so now we are the most marginalized. We are receiving pressure from government, industry, destroying our land, destroying our natural resources. We have the greenhouse gases, who is more ever. The world is facing the most hot temperatures around the world. And for us, it is not about the numbers of the temperature. It is about losing our knowledge. Because when we lose a biodiversity species, it is losing our knowledge. And our knowledge are so rich because our environment are rich. So how we can all protect our traditional knowledge to protect the rest of the species of the world and to fight the climate change. Of course, in the recent years, we do have the important progress that recognize the indigenous people's traditional knowledge and valuing them. And then the Kunming biodiversity outcome show that the indigenous peoples are the most who are protecting the biodiversity. And we have the climate change conventions through the Paris Agreement who recognize the indigenous peoples. And I believe that with this convention and the role of UNESCO in the member state, it can become very practical and efficient to protect the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples. We need to do the inventory, that can respect our intellectual property rights, because it is our knowledge who are there, the knowledge of our communities. Safeguarding them and creating a safeguard for the intellectual property rights is very important for our knowledge. We need the methodology to collaborate as partners to protect and promote the indigenous people's traditional knowledge. For instance, I am doing the 3D or 2D participatory mapping that can help to combine the best knowledge from the technology and then the best, greatest knowledge of our communities. So how we can use and bridge the gap and safeguard our knowledge. So we also need to fulfill the respect of the indigenous people's rights to protect our land, territories, and resources. Because if our rights are not respected, our knowledge cannot be protected. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hindu. And I think, again, there's some very important ideas put out there. And we heard this morning perhaps about having the different culture conventions working together and reinforcing each other. But I think here we also are hearing a cry perhaps for a role of the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage being maybe better integrated also with the biodiversity and climate agreements that are so critical to the world today. So there's an interesting idea, and thank you very much. And it brings us to our next also online panelist, who we're also very honored to have and would like to thank her for taking the time. Karima Benoune, who is the former special rapporteur for climate change, author of the report on culture, climate change, and cultural rights, and special rapporteur on cultural rights. Dr. Benoune, you're a professor at the University of Michigan Law School. You are known as a scholar and human rights expert and advocate. You served as the UN Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights from 2015 to 2021 and contributed as an expert for the International Criminal Court during a case involving the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage sites in Mali. You have taught on a wide range of university courses, and your work has been published in many renowned journals. So again, I thank you for being with us. And I'd just like to ask, when you were a special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, you prepared a fascinating and insightful report on climate change, culture, and cultural rights. So I was wondering if you could speak about the importance of cultural heritage and cultural rights in meeting the challenges of climate change. And what are your recommendations to implement cultural rights and safeguard living heritage in the face of the climate emergency?
Thank you very much for these questions, and greetings. Annyeonghaseyo. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be in the great city of Seoul with you today, but I'm truly honored to participate virtually as a former UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights who had the privilege of collaborating with UNESCO many times. I thank the organizers for putting this important event together to mark the 20th anniversary of the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and for including me along with these distinguished fellow speakers. For me, it is nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was feeling tired, but I'm so energized by the remarks that we've already heard. So very happy to be staying awake with you. And we have to be wide awake in these times when we face the threat of the climate emergency. When I was the Special Rapporteur, I emphasized the protection of cultural heritage is also a human rights issue. And I took a holistic approach to heritage, trying to ensure that intangible heritage receives the full attention it so deserves. The specific topic of the role of cultural heritage in challenging climate change could not be more important in this moment, when in some places people can cook an egg on the sidewalk. It's so hot. Across the world, human beings are experiencing heat waves and other forms of extreme weather. And let's be clear, this is just a prelude to what we will face if we fail to take effective climate action. While we have to face up to the scale of the challenges, which are grave indeed, I also hope we will approach our subject matter with a spirit of urgent optimism, remembering the words of Berta Cáceres, the slain Honduran indigenous rights defender, who said, "Let us come together and remain hopeful as we defend and care for the blood of this earth and its spirit." I think of those words when I do this work and participate in these discussions. And I want to think about what it means to do what she asked us to do today in 2023, specifically by using cultural heritage. And I'm going to draw on my 2016 report to the General Assembly on heritage and human rights, as well as my 2020 report for the GA on cultural rights and climate change, which you can now find at the top of my Twitter feed at Karima Benoun. I wanted to make it easy to find if you'd like to take a look at the report. So urgent action on climate change is needed to protect the cultures and cultural rights of billions of people around the world, and to avoid what I called in my report the cultural extinction of the most vulnerable. As an official in Tuvalu asked me during my mission to his country, if we are not here anymore, what will happen to our culture? Imagine having to ask that question. The climate emergency is one of the greatest threats humanity has ever faced, and it is, I argue, the leading global threat to cultural rights, though there are, of course, others. This threat has to be effectively addressed now. The negative impacts of climate change on human cultures must be placed high on the international agenda. And this is equally true of the positive potential of our cultures, including our intangible heritage and the exercise of our cultural rights to serve as critical tools in our response to the climate emergency. What I argue is that we need a tripartite integration of environmental, cultural, and human rights perspectives on climate change in both policy and expertise. And we need to see the creation of channels of communication and cooperation between policymakers and civil society in all these three areas. Again, climate change and cultural heritage and human rights. What I'm arguing for the purposes of our topic tonight is that we need to understand and reimagine the 2003 convention as also being a resource for developing a cultural rights-based approach to climate change. And time is very short. I just want to emphasize two main points. The first is that we have to deal with the scale of the threat the climate emergency poses to cultures, and we've heard this from some of the previous speakers. We may lose nothing less than centuries of human cultural achievement, many of the cultural practices that people hold most dear, and even their entire ways of life. As I stressed in my 2020 report, holistic assessment of heritage impacts from climate change is essential. Not only tangible and natural heritage, but also the practice and transmission of a host of rich, intangible cultural heritage practices, from oral traditions to festive events to interactions and relationships with nature. All of these are at risk. And as I always said when I was the special rapporteur, tangible, intangible, and natural heritage are largely porous and overlapping categories, and human beings enjoy their related human rights really across them in a holistic way. So this means that the effects of climate change on cultural heritage also have to be assessed holistically. Losses reported in the intangible heritage area already include the ability to live on ancestral lands, the guardianship of sacred sites, folklore, traditional medicine, and cultural knowledge, including, as we've just heard so eloquently, indigenous knowledge and practice. Less documentation, monitoring, and analysis of intangible heritage impacts has been undertaken, and this is urgently needed. As ICHCAP stressed in its submission for my report on climate change and culture, identifying knowledge and belief systems at risk from climate change must become a priority. Popular engagement, citizen science, and appropriate use of traditional and indigenous knowledge in monitoring processes should be encouraged. The documentation for nominations to the lists of the 2003 convention is one potential source for understanding threats posed to ICH by climate change. The 2015 operational directives for the 2003 convention focus on fostering grassroots resilience to natural hazards and climate change. States are encouraged to fully integrate communities, groups, and individuals who are bearers of such knowledge into systems and programs of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I think we have to repeat this again and again. I hope that UNESCO and states parties to the convention will maximize the use of Criterion 5 from the operational guidelines for implementation of the World Heritage Convention concerning heritage that has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. And I understand some informal approaches to this question have been under discussion, and what I really hope is that those will continue and be formalized. We also have to remember that while the climate emergency threatens humanity in its entirety and all human cultures, I cannot stress enough that the impacts hit specific peoples and places disproportionately, posing particular threats to the cultures of populations living in the most vulnerable environments, such as small island developing states, as well as indigenous peoples, women, and youth. So we have to be committed to climate culture justice. And I repeat my call at the General Assembly for the international community to adopt a human rights-based global action plan to save the cultures of humanity and protect cultural rights from the climate emergency. Such a plan needs to fully incorporate intangible heritage. Finally, I want to say that even as they are under threat, cultural rights and cultural resources are powerful allies in the battle against climate change. They should be more fully integrated into climate action. Climate heritage and traditional knowledge are climate assets and should be recognized as such. Where relevant and appropriate human rights respecting traditional knowledge systems exist, every effort should be made to integrate these into heritage site disaster management plans. As the Seoul Vision document helpfully stresses, cultural heritage can help us benefit from lessons learned in the past about coping with environmental changes and about the integration of nature and culture. And they can promote an ethic of stewardship and reuse that we need so much now. I'm delighted to note that efforts to mainstream culture and heritage into climate action have led to a campaign to get a joint work decision adopted at COP28. This would start a one-year consultation by the UNFCCC that would hopefully result at COP29 in the adoption of a work program on culture-based climate action. We all need to support efforts to make this happen and to fully integrate intangible heritage and the 2003 convention in this work. And I can think of no better outcome of our celebration of this 20th anniversary than if we see this endeavor succeed. Let me conclude by saying that we know that cultures and cultural rights have inherent value, but we also must now recognize their tremendous utility in our existential fight against climate change. This means that we have yet one more reason to protect cultural heritage and ensure cultural rights. Without them, we are at even greater risk in our warming world. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Benoon, and also for staying up late and participating with us on this important topic. And thank you also for bringing in also the crucial human rights pillar of what we're discussing, but also finishing on that hopeful note that we have this instrument that can help us mobilize these resources once we acknowledge them first and move with them. So this will now, so thank you for that, and we'll come now to our next panelist. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Kyung-Koo Han. So I will call you Kyung-Koo, if that's okay. You are the Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, and you've taught anthropology at Kangwon National University, and served as the Dean at Kookmin University, as well as at Seoul National University. You were a member of the Policy Planning Committee of the Korea Federation for the Environmental Movement, as well as the Presidential Commission for Sustainable Development. So now I'm going to ask you a question in your capacity as Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, and ask you what kind of synergies you might see between the 2003 convention and other programs in relation to themes around biodiversity and climate change.
예, 유네스코에서 아주 중요한 질문을 주셨습니다. 좋은 문제 제기에
Thank you very much for the very good question, and thank you for raising this very important topic. I understand that recently there have been a lot of emphasis on multi-sectoral and transversal approach on the parts of UNESCO. I believe that this is very encouraging, that we're seeing a lot of these multi-sectoral approaches at UNESCO. And education, heritage education, there's a lot of emphasis on sustainable developments and climate change. And even in global citizen education, there's also a lot of emphasis placed on World Heritage and ICH, as well as cultural diversity and sustainable developments and climate change. In UNESCO, there are very excellent scientific programs having to do with biodiversity and climate change. However, there is a lack of synergy effect tied in with ICH programs. So I think it's very important for us to find the synergy together with science-themed programs, because we understand that a lot of ICH, while it is cultural heritage passed down by humans, a lot of them have to do with nature. So I do think that we need to find those synergy effects with science programs. So for example, there are 5 that I would like to talk about. There is the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. These are 2 very ancient commissions, both passed in 1960s. The programs have been expanded over the years, and there is a lot of emphasis on sustainable development to respond to the demand of the times. I believe that these tie in with SDG goal number 6 and goal number 14, having to do with water and marine life. These are really having to do with natural and scientific research programs. And recently there were the Global Geoparks program, very recent in 2015. So this has to do with science and culture as well, and science and nature. And there is the Man and Biosphere, the MAB program, which was created in the 70s. And there is this emphasis on man there, on humans. So this has to do with the relationship between humans and nature. So there is a high emphasis with this relationship to ICH. I believe that there's also, with World Heritage, there's these various programs like geologic parks, which are majestic, huge in scale. And these have to do with the majesty of nature. We feel that we are so small and humble when we stand in the face of this majesty of nature. Mother Nature creating wind and rain and thunder and lightning and clouds. For a long time, we have worshipped the forces of nature. Nature has been so large and unpredictable, but they've always been ever present. We were powerless in the face of nature. And if we tried to bring some changes to nature, they would always come back. We have tried to look at nature in that way. We have tried to make use of nature and understand nature. And when we look at ICH practices, they have either tried to make use of nature or tried to use the forces of nature. But in the past, we thought that nature is all-powerful and that it will always be there. But no longer can we expect that to be true. Because right now, after the industrial revolutions, with the accelerated progress made in science and technology and in our industry, we're now maintaining a very shaky balance with nature, because the nature that we have known has changed. And there is this risk that it can be completely, fundamentally changed in an instant. So this means that if we look at the science programs of UNESCO, yes, nature can be majestic. However, the science programs of UNESCO continue to stress only that point, the majesty of nature. The ICH programs many of them have to do with nature. Many of them have to do with the changes in the seasons, in nature. And we understand that climate change is threatening the very origin and the foundation of ICH. Climate change has also brought about changes in the animal life, the flora and fauna, the seasons, and the weathers that are very closely tied in with living heritage. such as our practices of farming, agriculture, of growing crops, rituals. Many of them have become impossible to continue to have because of climate change. Oh, we understand that ultimately, if we look at ICH, there is that hope contained within for a stable climate and a sustainability in animal and flora resources. We understand that climate change has brought about serious threats. Of course, the international community has tried to safeguard much of our cultural resources through the 2003 convention, but climate change has rendered much of this very difficult to safeguard. If these have been murdered in the past, in the future, they might come under the situation of genocide. So we must respond to the serious threats of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. To do that, we must look into ourselves and try to find ways of coexistence where humans and nature and culture can all coexist together. And I do think that ICH can provide a solution to that, which is why the ICH Convention and UNESCO's other programs should be integrated together to try to create more synergy effects. And to that end, I would like to make 3 proposals. The first is UNESCO's science-themed programs should have a more active cultural perspective. I am the Secretary General of the National Korea Commission of UNESCO, and also as a cultural anthropologist, I would say that there is a lot of these excellent UNESCO science programs in oceanography and hydrology, but I don't think there is enough of a cultural perspective there. I do think that there needs to be more of a cultural perspective in these science programs. And secondly, I propose that we can include the perspective of ICH, Intangible Cultural Heritage, in the programs having to do with natural rights and the rights of humans. Unlike the MAB program, which incorporates the word man, I do think that it's still focusing on nature and ecosystem. So with these biospheres, we have to increase people's awareness on living heritage as well. So these are some of the areas that I would like to propose. And lastly, I think that we need to I would like to make a proposal on the 2003 Convention inscription process, which is a very important process to raise awareness on the important values of UNESCO. I think that perhaps we can prioritize those ICH elements that are particularly closely tied in with biodiversity and response to climate change. There may be many member countries that have excellent heritage elements but might not have enough experience in inscription process, so perhaps we can provide workshops maybe once a year on them. I think that this capacity building international workshop by the National Commission of UNESCO for Korea could be a good benchmark model. These are the proposals that I would like to make, and I hope that we can identify further synergies between these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Han. I think lots of fascinating ideas there as well on how to synergize. It's a theme that's coming through, I think, from all our panelists so far, that we must think of this convention within the broader framework of issues going on, and particularly in the environmental issues, and how can we position it to engage much more strongly, perhaps, with some of those other processes, including in UNESCO, but also we heard before, beyond. So now it's a pleasure to introduce the next and final panelist. I call her Gulnara because we know each other, but it's Dr. Aitpaiva, who has been very active in the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. You're a researcher and the director of the ICHCAP Cultural Research Center, which is an accredited NGO under the 2003 convention. You also represented Kyrgyzstan in the Intergovernmental Committee on ICH from 2012 to 2016 and served as an expert in its subsidiary body from 2013 and 2015. And you now have returned for a second mandate in the evaluation body last year. Your research focuses on lesser-known aspects of Kyrgyzstan's cultural and natural heritage, integrating folk and scholarly epistemologies. And you've done extensive research on sacred natural sites. So my question to you would be, how can these sacred natural sites, or these sacred sites, foster the human relationship to nature and contribute to biodiversity conservation and its sustainable use? And in particular, how does the ICH safeguarding play in that relationship?
Thank you very much, team, for introducing me. And I would like to greet all of you. Good afternoon. First of all, I am very honored and moved to be among you, stakeholders of ICH. And the Republic of Korea is absolutely impressive country to be. And thank you for the country and its representatives. Let me answer on the questions from team based on the Kyrgyz case of the sacred sites. But I would like to mention that during last several years, several nomination files from different countries dedicated sacred sites or practices associated with sacred sites were successfully inscribed in different lists of UNESCO. So Kyrgyz case somehow reflects an international experience. When this convention started its life, our organization started researching sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan, and at that time we did know nothing about the convention. With custodians and communities, we identified and described more than 100 sites which are located around the country. I have the map, but probably it could not come. What is important about these sites? All of them encompass a wide array of natural elements, such as springs, mountains, caves, trees, lakes, and stones. While some sites are man-made structures, like monuments or graveyards, they blend into the natural environment. According to one of the folk classifications which we found in one of the remote regions, vast majority of the sacred site belong to the Jer-Su, or sites of land and water. In other words, all of these sites have spiritual guardians like birds, trees, animals. One of the old healers, which we used to work together for many years, used to express the formula: a white candle for the white side and a blue candle for a blue side. She learned this formula from her masters, and this formula keeps and transmits the ancient knowledge about the individuality and significance of each site. The idea of diversity, including biodiversity, is deeply embedded in the very nature of sacred sites. In 2008-2010, we conducted a large research on 6 sacred sites in a particular smaller province. And the findings of this research revealed that a notable difference between the biodiversity of the sacred sites themselves and the surrounding areas. It is essential to emphasize that biodiversity is not an isolated concept among Kyrgyz traditional communities. It is rather an integral part of a larger cultural paradigm. It is interwoven within the fabric of cultural beliefs and practices. These beliefs and practices are based on the philosophy of reciprocity. This site provides safety and well-being, and humans in turn must care for and protect it. This belief is mutual care, nurtures and safeguards the flora and fauna of sacred sites. Kyrgyz people take care about biodiversity through diverse rituals, nurturing their bond with the natural environment. During our research observations around the sacred lakes in the remote south region, we witnessed a remarkable folk protection mechanism known as Bata, blessing ritual. This ritual was specifically aimed at banning fishing in the Kulun River. The Bata ritual exemplifies a successful local approach that delivers visible results in the short time, in 3 years, without the need for substantial resources. To address the question of why human-nature relations are crucial in facing today's challenges and how living heritage can strengthen these connections, it is insightful to look back at the restoration of the sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan. The massive restoration of sacred sites in our country took place in 1990-2000 years, in the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The collapse of Soviet Union was an unexpected, terrible disaster for most of its citizens, including Kyrgyz people. In this time of total uncertainty and then drastic redesign of social space, people needed hope and belief in miracles. Sacred sites emerged as places where faith were rekindled and hope finds support. In the face of disintegrating customary relations, nature and ancestors who became a part of nature, they offered vital support to the indigenous ethnic groups of the newly independent country. The natural sacred sites provided strength and grassrooted resilience. I use this recent history to show how human-nature relations rooted in living heritage have played a pivotal role in supporting and empowering individuals, communities in Kyrgyzstan, even participated in nation-building process. The sacred sites form a significant part of the country physical map, reflecting the interweaving of ideas, knowledge, and practices that extend beyond their physical presence. There is a big sacred site, Ata Beyit, the grave of fathers, near the capital of the country in Bishkek. At Ata Beyit, there are words above the arch, the white bends but doesn't break. This traditional philosophy of Kyrgyz people work for the entire sacred space. The concept of ak in Kyrgyz language or white in Kyrgyz language is always positive and broad. The words, the notions of transparency and justice have the same roots of white. The sacred geography is as a form of communal self-organization and mobilization emerged during Kyrgyzstan's nation-building process. It reflects a strategy of survival, self-identification, and safety rooted in traditional beliefs. Living heritage represented by sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan offers an important insight into the importance of human-nature relations. The sacred geography's principles of justice, mutual responsibility, and interconnection resonate deeply with the people, serving as a guide force to address today's challenges and create a more sustainable future. Now, Convention 2003 is becoming even more important tool for local people like Kyrgyz because it is a document helping to protect all of our heritage in front of the global and other challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gulnara, for, I think, fascinating insight to not only the human-nature relationship and the importance of these sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan, but also how the role it played in what you described, major historical and political changes and turmoil. So we see this other dimension of the living heritage, very important for people's well-being and continuity. We're a little bit behind time, but we started a little bit late. So I would, especially for those of you who are online with us late at night, I would like to give the opportunity to the audience to ask maybe 2 questions, maybe 3 if anybody has any questions. If anybody would like to ask any of our panelists any questions, I can take 1 or 2 and we'll ask them to answer very briefly. I'm not sure. If I don't see questions, I might go for some just final wrap-up words from the various panelists. Do I see? I have 1 hand here. Okay, I see. Could you please introduce yourself when you ask your question? And please, if your question is directed to a specific panelist, please state so.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask a question again. So my name is Janet Blake. I'm Associate Professor of Human Rights Law at Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran. And I would like to address my question particularly to Professor Karima Benouné. It relates to this issue of the synergy between not just different treaties, but actually different areas of international law, and whether you think that the World Heritage Convention, with 195 states parties, has or could be used more by the international community to exercise obligations to protect the climate, as much as including intangible cultural heritage and heritage more generally within the Climate Change Convention, but whether we should also be thinking about how the World Heritage Convention particularly can help us to protect the climate. Thank you.
I think, sorry, do we have our panelists? Oh, please, yeah, if you could. It's a rather, we have tight for time, so I'll ask you to answer in a minute or two, if you could. I know it's a very profound question. Please, Professor Benouné.
Thank you very much for this important question, and I hope we can have an ongoing conversation about this. I think we have to look for every resource that we can, and we have to think holistically across international law, both in the area of cultural heritage protection, also in the area of cultural rights protection and the human rights treaties. And I think this is why I suggested the particular sort of possibility of using that criterion 5 related to the World Heritage Convention. I think that that is an avenue that needs to be more fully explored. And I would say also in the human rights area, I don't think that we've done enough in terms of reminding states that they actually have legal obligations to protect culture and cultural rights, and the human right to have access to and to enjoy cultural heritage, including the heritage of others. So again, I think this speaks to this integration, bringing together the heritage standards that we have, the environmental standards that we have, and the human rights standards that we have, and using them in an intersectional way. And there's much more that could be said, but I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Since I don't see any more questions, perhaps would any panelists, Hindu, would you like to make any last remark? I think maybe Hindu's frozen.
Yeah, thank you so much, team. Just I wanted to say that we cannot talk about protecting cultural heritage without protecting the rights of indigenous communities. So our rights to our land, to our territories, to our resources are most important to protect our culture, our identity, and our traditional knowledge. And that need to be into the recognitions of these conventions within the climate change negotiations and within also the biodiversity negotiation. They cannot tackle them in silo without just connecting it to these conventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you again for being with us. Ralph, Minister Regan-Vanu, I'm not sure if the connection is still good. If not, perhaps Dr. Han, you'd like to say some last?
I think that I was overly critical of the UNESCO science programs, but I should say that when we talk about education or culture, there's a lot of synergy that is existing between the two. There are many best practices that we can look to, and particularly in the last General Assembly, the Education for the Future report, if we look at that, we see that education is something that a whole of society approach is needed, and lifelong learning and higher education. There's a lot of mention about these topics, and I think that they all are tied in with the ICH convention, and there's possibility for a lot of synergy effect between the two. And even within culture, there's a Creative Cities network, for example, which I do think that can also maximize the potential of a synergy between the two. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Synergy and holistic approaches do exist in many traditional systems, and probably the further development of convention could be done taking into account these systems. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. I think I won't try to go over everything that was said. I think we got some very strong messages very clearly from different parts of the world, that the importance of living heritage in facing many of these crises we're facing, the climate change, the loss of biodiversity, environmental degradation, and in particular for certain populations, but also in a more generic way as a way of reshaping a relationship to the natural world. We also heard a lot of call for more integration with the various instruments and various other programs going on. And I think this is something that the convention will have to keep working on, maybe beyond also the other cultural conventions, but really getting into some of the environmental conventions, environmental-related conventions and programs. So with that, I'd like to thank all the panelists sorry, Professor Benoon, you answered a question. Do you want to have a quick wrap-up word as well, or do you feel?
I would just very quickly say, please take a look at my report from 2020. I think that I answered Professor Blake's question in a more thorough way in that report. But also, let's think about how we can interpret the heritage conventions, taking human rights into consideration. We don't do that often enough. The human rights piece disappears out of the discussion. And I think it's critical to reminding people why heritage is so important, that we can't enjoy a wide range of our human rights, whether it's freedom of religion, whether it's economic rights of people related who work in the heritage and tourism sectors, without the protection of heritage. So let's keep the human rights lens focused on this issue. And thanks so much for listening, and I hope I'm making sense at 1:30 in the morning.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Yes, I think it makes a lot of sense, and we've also seen a clear sort of convergence between these natural issues, human rights, and of course cultural rights and intangible cultural heritage being mentioned, I think, across all panelists. With that, I think we can end this panel. Once again, I'd really like to thank all the panelists for your participation, and I believe we'll move to the next panel. We will capture many of these ideas, I think, in the final version of the Seoul vision, which will help guide the convention in the years to come. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. ICH can connect humans to nature and also contribute to the restoration of communities, and we can make effective use of ICH to try to bring about social change for the future of the planet. With that, we'll take a short coffee break. The Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation is hosting an exhibit in the lobby, and also there's a new technology-inspired exhibition that is fostered by a Korean Science and Technology Foundation that we invite you to take a look at. Please enjoy the coffee break, and after that, we'd like to have today's last session, Living Heritage and Quality Education. Thank you.